not direct at you, but maybe. All right. Well, good morning. I'd love to welcome you again to Commonplace Church. If this is your first time, which looking out, there aren't too many first timers out there. My name is Sam Waldron, college pastor here. Excited that you're here with us. We are going through a series called Reset. At the beginning of the year, it's just kind of natural for us to kind of evaluate how our last year went. See some trends maybe that popped up over the years, some struggles, some successes, and as we look forward to a new year, we ask ourselves, how can we do this one maybe a little bit better? And so we've been going through this series, what are buttons that we can hit in our lives, some reset buttons, to kind of do things over and try to not, again, for the main purpose and for the ultimate purpose of serving God and loving Him with our whole life. Well, today we're going to continue in that series. And today, I want to start by asking you a question. How many of you have trouble to sticking to your New Year's resolutions? Yeah? All right. I see some hands. The beginning of the year, like we said, it's an exciting time. The last year you can kind of toss behind you with all its struggles and failures. And you can look ahead with excitement about some new, fresh goals, that it's going to make your life so much better. So, how many of you in here have currently made New Year's resolutions and that you're sticking to, that you're trying to go for? Does anybody want to share a couple? Jared, you got one?
I am trying to maintain Mondays and Wednesday nights as wedding nights.
Nice.
So get out of the house, hour and a half.
Good.
It's not working so well.
Hey, it's early. It's
I'm
early.
trying really hard.
Good. Anybody else want to share a New Year's resolution? Well, that's all right. I don't like to share mine until after I've completed them and then tell people, hey, guess what? I completed my New Year's resolution. That hasn't happened very often. Like one time in 2009, this came up in my Facebook feed. I wrote this post, 26.2 in 2010. Anybody know what those numbers mean? Marathon. Well, to this day, I have yet to register for a marathon. So I am right there with you. But we can think beyond New Year's resolutions and just goals that we set for our lives. For students starting a new semester, they have these, I remember going into my freshman year having these aspirations to be the best student, to excel at all my classes, to get done with all my assignments super early so then I can relax and be less stressed than I was in high school. Well, something happened that very first week. After the professor gave me my syllabus and I saw all the assignments and all the readings I had to do and all the dates in which they were due, I thought it was a mistake, like he had just given me the answers. I thought I can do all my work and relax the rest of the semester. But something happened the first night I fell asleep in my college dorm room after receiving my syllabus. Something I can only describe as mystical. Because as I laid my head to rest, I was full set on excelling in my academics. But that next morning when I woke up, I became a typical college student. And procrastination was the name of the game until the very last week of the semester when I didn't sleep a wink and I barely survived my final exams. It's not just a problem that students have in college. I think even as adults, we still struggle. It's a human problem with procrastination, with struggling with reaching our goals. We've just realized as adults that it's something that we can't, if we mess up, it's going to be a hefty cost. Like paying a bill or picking up a child from school or going grocery shopping. If we don't do those things, bad things happen. So the question for us today is, why is there such a disconnect between the goals that we set for our lives, the things we really want to do, and the option B realities that we actually are living? Why is there such a disconnect between our goals and our realities? Well, that's what we're talking about today. Why do we have trouble living up to the chief goals that we set for our lives? Now, the chief goal for our lives, I'm not talking about like running a marathon. That would be really cool to do that one day. now I'm talking about the thing in which you wrap your entire life around. You know, we run into people at work and at school who have these chief goals of their lives that look a little different. Maybe some people are going towards success and security or popularity or significance. Maybe the goal of their life is to raise the perfect family. And it's not wrong. These goals in them of themselves aren't wrong goals to have. But for those of us in here, those of us who call Jesus our Savior, there is a goal in which He calls all of us to wrap our entire lives around. And that's the goal we're going to be looking at today. Because even though that goal is really good, and it's what Jesus calls us to, we still, just like everybody else in the world, have trouble reaching that expectation. So what is the ultimate goal for our lives as Christ followers? So we're going to open up Scripture today. We're actually going to go to the Old Testament, to the 5th book in the Bible, Deuteronomy. Now, Deuteronomy is the 5th book in the Bible. It's the 5th book of the Torah. And this 5 books of Scripture was so important to God's people from the very beginning of their existence. They saw these first 5 books as more than just like the constitution from which they lived their lives. They actually saw it as the pathway into which to have a flourishing relationship with God and a life here on earth. But there's this one verse in Deuteronomy chapter 6 that Jesus actually quotes later down the line when someone asks him, what's the most important commandment in all of the law? And Jesus goes directly to Deuteronomy chapter 6, verse 5. So friends, this is the command by which we are called to wrap our entire lives around. And here it is. You shall love the Lord your God with all of your heart, with all of your soul, and with all of your might. And maybe you remember Jesus goes on and say the second is like it, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. But if you think about this law for a moment, if you think about this goal for our lives, if our lives are totally driven by the love of God and the love for God, everything else is going to fall in place, right? We're going to love our wife. We're going to love our kids. We're going to love our neighbor. We're going to love our enemies. We're going to work super hard at our job because we know that it's a gift to God. If we can get this goal, if we can attain this goal, then our lives as we know it will begin to make sense. So the question is, how did you do this past year with this specific goal in your life? How many of you can say that if we asked your wife or your roommate or your professors or your kids, that they would say, oh yeah, you know, Bob isn't a perfect man, but he's one who loves God with his whole life. Or my mom, well, of all the things that she said and she did this year, one thing is clear. She loves God so much. If that's you this morning, and I know that there's some of you in here, that's awesome. Because there's several of you in here who I could say, this person is driven by the love of God. And I love that I get to look up to you and see you as an example in our congregation. But for the rest of us, and maybe for some of you in here, there's some people who are deeply struggling with following God and loving Him with your full heart. Maybe it's been a struggle your whole life, fighting your desire to chase after other things that the world says are more important than this goal. Goals of power and money and success, abandoning your relationship with God as you chase after these things, or maybe at best just treating Him like some side piece relationship. So if you hear this today, I want you to know that this isn't how things have to be. We want your relationship with God to flourish. That's something we're passionate about here at Commonplace Church and our Connect, Grow, and Serve vision. So even though our target's good, it's hard for us to hit it. So we need to hit the reset button somewhere. Now let me take a minute and just tell you what we're not talking about today, because this is important. Before I jump into that, what we're not talking about today is the free gift of salvation that God gives us through Jesus, right? This is why the message of the gospel is such a groundbreaking reality for us Christians. While we were still sinners, while we were a mess, Jesus loved us so much that He died for us. while we were only giving 5% in the relationship, God went 195% to rescue us, to bring us into His house. And guess what? That counts for eternity. So no matter what your year was like last year, no matter what your year is going to be like this year, no matter what happens by the end of the day, if you've received that gift of salvation, there is nothing that can take the love of Jesus from you. So let's take a big breath and a sigh of relief. Know that we don't have to have all A's on a report card in order for God to keep us in His family. But what we are talking about today is tapping into the blessings of the life of God. You know, being a part of God's family means that we don't have to live on the street anymore. But the problem is, for a lot of us, it's not that God's grace isn't enough. It's that we try to do things our own way. We still try to live by the law of the streets when God has welcomed us into His house, into His family. And that is just a tough life to live. So if that's you today, don't you desire to live a life that's truly driven by the love of God? But how do we do that? Well, God actually gives His people a pathway and how to make the love of God the center of their life. And He does that in the next few verses. And guess what? It doesn't have anything to do with shaving your head, putting on a robe, and living in a monastery, or selling your left arm. In fact, making this goal and living up to it is a very simple thing to do. Simple pathway. All right, so let's see what God says. Let's read the verse that we just read for a minute. Deuteronomy 6:5. You shall love the Lord your God with all of your heart, with all of your soul, and with all of your might. Now, how do we do that? Continue on. And these words that I command to you today shall be on your heart. You shall teach them diligently to your children. You shall talk of them when you sit in your house, and when you walk by the way, and when you lie down, and when you rise. You shall bind them as a sign on your hand, and they shall be as frontlets between your eyes. You shall write them on the doorposts of your house and on your gates. To be totally captivated and driven by the love of God in our lives is way simpler than maybe we could have ever imagined. It has less to do about doing miraculous acts and moving mountains, and way more to do about normal, everyday life. It has to do with our routines. So today, the message is to push the reset button on our routines. Listen to what it says in this past verse. It says, as you parent your kids, as you hang out in your house, as you commute to and from work, in your bedtime routine, in your morning routine, in the thing you do with your hands throughout the day, and the thing that you focus your attention and energy on. And every one of these activities, make it a gift. Make it as if it's a gift to God. Let the love of God seep into every one of your activities. So in a word, the thing that we've been missing is that we've been living routines that are preventing us from living this out. So I want you to think about your normal day. We're going to be thinking about our normal day a lot. What do you do when you wake up? What about the first thing you do when you get to work? Or your default activity when you're on lunch break? What about after work, or after your last class, or after the kids go to bed? What do you do right when you get home, or right before you go to sleep? What about a normal week? If you were to look at the number of hours that you use for certain things like sleep and family time, social time, study and devotion, how does that all kind of balance out? What does that look like? Because the answer to this question, or these questions, is so important. Because as we'll see, no matter how pure and grand our intentions are to love God, no matter how passionate we are writing that New Year's resolution down, if it doesn't affect our day-to-day routines, then you can kiss that goal goodbye, because we'll never hit our target. Have you ever thought about the power of your boring routines? Well, the cool thing about this is that the Bible doesn't just make this some arbitrary law. You have to change your routine around God. But modern psychology and sociology are confirming this very thing. There are some scholars from Harvard who've been writing, like Timothy Wilson wrote a book called Strangers to Ourselves, Discovering the Adaptive Unconscious. There is a French philosopher named Maurice Merleau-Ponty. If you care about any of this, maybe Tim Dobos cares about this. People have written and are discovering that the boring things that we do throughout our day affect our hearts, our minds, and what we direct our lives to. James Smith, I've quoted him before, he wrote this book called Desiring the Kingdom, and he says, over time, rituals and practices, aka our routines, mold and shape, get ready for this, our precognitive disposition to the world by training our desires. In other words, our routines, more than our goals, are the things that teach our hearts what to love. So I have a little graph here that we handed out as you came in this morning. This graph is also in his book, and it's awesome. Because what it says basically is that our routines act as sort of like a cookie cutter mold for our heart. And they influence our habits. And our habits, which just naturally come out, like Jesus says, from the wellspring of the heart, the mouth speaks. Our habits influence then our wills and desires. And it's our desires that drive us to the target. Not our intentions. It's the things that our hearts really want. If we were to really pull back all the veneer, what our hearts really want that gets us to the target. And the Bible's full of passages that kind of back this up. For instance, Psalm 37, 3 through 4. Maybe you've heard this passage a lot. But it says, trust in the Lord and do good. Dwell in the land and befriend faithfulness. Delight yourself in the Lord, and He will give you the desires of your heart. So breaking this down for a minute, trust in the Lord and do good. That's our actions. That's our routines. Dwell in the land and befriend faithfulness every single day. And everything we do, honor God. Delight yourself in the Lord. Our hearts are molded by that routine, and He will give you the desires of your heart. If we make a routine that revolves around trusting God in all we do and say, He'll give us the desires of our heart. Now, that seems pretty risky, right? I mean, couldn't you imagine someone walking in here and says, oh, okay, I figured out the secret. All I got to do is do what God says, and then He's going to give me the desires of my heart, because I have some really, expensive desires. But it's actually not risky at all, because God knows how we work. He designed us. God knows that our routines and day after day doing what He has called us to do influence our habits, and our habits influence our desires. If we routinely put our trust and our love in God, then our hearts will just naturally desire Him above all else. And God is ready and willing to give that desire to us. Here's another way to think about routine. How many of you all have tried to develop the skill of archery before? Anybody bow hunters and go out? That's cool. I would love to do that. But so if you've tried to figure out shooting a bow, if you try to develop that skill without any instructor, it's tough, right? Has anybody self-taught, figured it out yourself? All right, awesome. Tyler, of course, the pilot in the room has taught himself. But it's tough without an instructor. Should I stick my elbow out? How far back should I pull the string? What angle should the bow be? How should I position my feet? Where should my shoulders be? All these questions are very difficult to answer when we first start out. But that's where an instructor comes in handy. They begin by teaching us not just with words, but by actually positioning our bodies physically in such a way, as this picture shows, on how we're supposed to hold the bow. And we see the target that we want to hit, and the instructor forms our body and helps us hit that target. And after some time goes by, the instructor is able to step back a little bit and just offer some helpful hints, because our body has learned how to hit the target that we're aiming at. When Kayla and I first started dating, we went bowling a lot. And she just always wanted to show me the proper form for some reason. She put her hands on my shoulders, and she put her hand on my hand. She just was very passionate about bowling. I didn't get it, but I became a better bowler, so that's great. So what if you've received that instruction. Imagine yourself at the archery range. Is that what it's called? And you've received the instruction, but for some reason, you keep doing exactly what the instructor told you, but you're still not hitting the target. You're not even close. Well, there's probably two reasons. One, maybe you just need more time to develop the form and the practice. Or two, you had a bad instructor. An instructor who was actually pointing you away from the target that you thought you were pointing at. Thinking back to our spiritual lives, the instructor of our lives is our routines. If we have good routines, they will point us to our target of loving God and living for Him. If we have bad routines, it's going to slowly instruct our lives to point at some other target that we did not even intend to hit. So let me ask this question to you again, and I have these questions written out. Just for a couple moments, I want you to answer these questions as honestly. You don't have to tell anybody, just answer them yourself, okay? We're going to talk about our routines, our daily routines. So, here's the first question. When I wake up in my bed, the very first thing I do is I usually give myself about blank hours or minutes before I have to leave for class, work, or the kids wake up and I got to take care of them. I fill most break times during the day with blank. The first thing I do when I get out of class, off work, or the kids go to sleep is blank. Next question. Other typical evening activities include the last thing I focus on before I go to sleep is during a typical week, I spend blank hours intentionally seeking the Lord. So going over your responses here, answer this for me. First of all, do you control your routines or do your routines control you? What parts of your routines instruct your heart to long for Jesus? And maybe what parts of your routine instruct your heart to long for something else? Or maybe what everybody else is going for at work. Or what you see on Instagram or whatever it might be. Success, relevance, popularity, security, or approval. Doing this exercise myself, I found that my morning routines are typically good. Sometimes they're good and strong. If it's a good day, I'll try to get out of bed and spend a half hour to an hour just going super slow, brewing some coffee, pour over coffee, sitting down at my dining room table, opening up a book, or just spending time in quiet, listening to music, being in prayer. And I've come to crave that time if I haven't had it. It's really cool. Like I never would have thought. I was the guy who always slept until the last minute. And sometimes I am. But I begin to crave this moment in my day if I haven't had it in a week. But on the other hand, my evening routine is pretty lacking. Most of the time when I get home from work, I'm so low on energy that really, if left to my own devices, I would plop on the couch and watch Netflix the whole night. That would be my life. There are other times I come home, but I'm still in work mode, and it takes Kayla reminding me that I'm home for me to put down the laptop or put down the phone at the dinner table. I've even found myself staying up late at night, just in my bed, scrolling mindlessly through Facebook and Instagram, being up half an hour or more later than I had even expected because I was on my phone. I think some of these routines have spawned from this desire maybe to be relevant or to be productive or to be necessary in my life. I don't know. But for some reason, these routines are a part of my life. And maybe you are thinking about your life and there are routines that you can point out right now that are like, man, I need to change that. I need to change that. Well, I want to give you 3 practical ways to combat bad routines. Right? Here's the first way to do that. To introduce counter routines. To actually just do another activity that will fight against the others. So James 4:7 says, "Submit yourself to God, therefore resist the devil, and he will flee from you." This is a promise. If we resist the devil, he will flee from us. If we resist bad habits, they will be reformed. over the past couple years, I've found ways to counter these bad routines. One simple thing that I've done in the past few months that has helped tremendously is by plugging my phone in downstairs to charge before I go upstairs to my bed to sleep. What I'll do is bring a book with me, and so if I'm not quite ready to sleep, I'll read and fill my mind with good things and good thoughts, and, whatever that book might be. And I can't even describe to you how that's kind of changed my mind a little bit. I sleep better. I just feel more energized. I'm not as attached to my phone during the day. So what counter routines can you bring in? We can think about some simple things, but bringing carrot sticks to work instead of Rice Krispie treats. I don't know, whatever it is for you. But what might it look like to introduce a counter routine? Well, secondly, here's another thing. To capture unmanaged time. Capture unmanaged time. Why is there a mouse on the screen, right? Well, when I was in college, my two best friends and I, we got this apartment that was just this awesome apartment that overlooked the skyline of Cincinnati, and it was beautiful. We just loved that place. Until one day that we noticed behind the microwave, you know what I'm going to say, right? We saw some mouse droppings. But no one said anything about it. And then the mouse droppings began to appear in plain sight on the counter. Still nothing. Then bags of chips were chewed through. Loaves of bread had chunks bitten out of them. It began to smell a little bit. It was getting disgusting. But you know how roommates are. It's kind of a game of chicken. Whoever breaks first is the one who is going to have to be in charge of figuring out the mess, or fixing the broken pipe, or catching the mouse. And so we waited a long time, hoping that this problem would go away, but it never did. So that's the same thing about our routines and unmanaged time. How many of you have trouble with time management? Like you don't even think about this chunk of your time during the day, but things happen, and you kind of wake up afterwards like, wow, what just happened? I'm so busy, it's been a blur, it's been a crazy day. Well, mismanaged time is a lot like a mouse in the house. You can ignore it and just survive, but things aren't going to get any better. So Gordon MacDonald, he wrote this book called Ordering Your Private World, and I just suggest this. This is like such a good book, very accessible. For those of you who just feel like your inner life is just a mess, you're not organized, you're not at peace, I would suggest you pick up this book. But he has 4 laws of unmanaged time. Unmanaged time flows toward our weaknesses. Unmanaged time comes under the influence of dominant people in my world. Unmanaged time surrenders to the demands of all emergencies. You ever feel like your whole life or your whole week is just putting out one fire and going to the next one, putting that out? And finally, unmanaged time gets invested in things that gain public acclamation, which sounds good at first until you find yourself neglecting all the inner stuff happening in your life. Proverbs 6 gives us an example from another pest, the ant. And this is a good example. It says, "Go to the ant, you sluggard." Let me read it up here. "Consider her ways and be wise. Without having any chief officer or ruler, she prepares her bread in the summer and gathers her food in harvest." So ants are good time managers. They use their time wisely. And the scripture tells us that we need to also, because if we don't manage our time and our routines will manage us. So thirdly, a way in which to combat bad routines is to add a spiritual discipline into your daily routine. I feel like I put this plug in every time I'm on the stage, the importance of including a spiritual discipline in your life. Because there is so much power in these simple acts that have been passed down to us over the past 2,000 years. What would it look like for you to incorporate one of these in your daily or weekly routines or every other day? Things like prayer and silence and studying, fellowship, service, worship, journaling, fasting. Luke 11:9 gives us this wonderful promise. "I tell you, ask and it will be given to you, seek and you'll find, knock and the door will be opened unto you." These spiritual disciplines have been handed down to us It is the action. It is the action of knocking on the door, seeking the Lord. And He's promised that when we do these activities, that He's going to show up. And when He shows up and we spend time with Him, our lives change dramatically. Right? So wrapping up today, maybe you're frustrated. You're disappointed with the reality of your life as it is right now. You've tried so hard following Jesus, but you find yourself defaulting to chasing after relationships. You found yourself snapping on the people that you hold dear to your life and you just can't get over it. You find yourself running late to everything you go to and no one can rely on you. And you find yourself with a routine that you're enslaved to that someone else has designed for your life. And all these things adding up has created this distance in your heart between you and the Lord, and you're frustrated with it. Well, friends, today I want to give you hope. Because I think most of us get tripped up because we underestimate what God can do with the insignificance of our normal, everyday lives. We fantasize about the big things, about what God is doing in the world, and about the big problems that need His attention, and maybe what we could do. But we need to understand that God is very much interested in the ordinary decisions, and is usually there waiting to use us. Maybe it's no surprise to you that I'm a big fan of Lord of the Rings. Right? I love what Tolkien is able to do, illuminating some deeply Christian themes in his book. And there's this one thing that I love. The Apostle Paul talks about how God uses the foolish things, the small things in this world to shame the wise and do incredible things. And we find Gandalf the Wizard saying this important proverb in the book of Lord of the Rings. He says, "Some believe it's only with great power that we can hold evil in check. But it's not what I have found. It's the small, everyday, ordinary folk that keep the darkness at bay. Small acts of kindness and love." He goes on to say, "Why have I picked Bilbo Baggins, the weakest person in all the world? Perhaps because I'm afraid and he gives me courage." Never underestimate the power of your simple faithfulness in your everyday life. The small, insignificant acts of faithfulness. You probably won't be the one who cures cancer. You probably won't be the one who passes the perfect healthcare law. But God rarely uses the kings to determine the fate of nations. It's the quiet, invisible people faithfully trusting Him and loving Him with their whole lives that God uses to keep the world spinning. Father, we come to you humbly today, not as people who have been faithful to the goals that we've set for our lives, but of people who have failed time and time again. We thank you that our effort is by